Unison is brought to you by the Young Committee of the International Federation for Choral Music. Hello and welcome to this Unison podcast brought to you by the International Federation on Choral Music. My name is Sam and I am the Oceania representative of the Young Committee from the IFCM. Today I am delighted to bring you an interview with David Squire. David Squire is from New Zealand and he's one of New Zealand's most prominent conductors. He's been the music director of the New Zealand Youth Choir since 2011, and he's the first alumnus director of that group. David's also the director of the Auckland Youth Choir and international award-winning ensembles Voicemale from Westlake Boys High School, Euphony from Kristin School, and the Westlake Symphony Orchestra. David's also the current vice chair of the New Zealand Association of Choral Directors, and he is a national conducting advisor and tutor. David served on the governance board of the New Zealand Choral Federation for 9 years, and he's now in demand around the world as a clinician, educator, guest conductor, and adjudicator. And he is the choral director for the International Schools Choral Music Society based in China. David, thank you very much for making some time for us.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So, David, you and I know each other a little bit. I've had the great pleasure of singing in your choirs, 3 of your choirs now. So we're very excited to have a chance to sit down and chat with you today. So what I thought we would do is this podcast is particularly interested in talking to experienced and gifted choral professionals like yourself. So we're keen to hear a little bit about your background, your career, and then perhaps in the second half we'll talk about some advice you might have for young choral musicians looking to make a career in the arts. So perhaps we could start with how you got into choral music, maybe first as a singer and how that developed into an interest in conducting.
Yes, absolutely. So I grew up in a very musical family. My mother was a church organist, and my dad had been a choir boy when he was very young. And music had always been in our house. So it was something that I just grew up experiencing. And apparently, I can't remember this, but when I was about 2, my parents took me to my first Handel's Messiah, and apparently in the middle of the Hallelujah chorus, I ran out into the aisle and just stood in the aisle with my mouth open, just staring at the choir and the orchestra in absolute wonder. And I suppose there was just never a time where I didn't think I would be a musician. So I started out by singing, and I did quite a lot of speech and drama when I was younger, and moved through various instruments and ended up on the clarinet. Was not a particularly good clarinetist, and stopped doing that after high school, and then went on to university to study conducting and composition. So that's kind of where things went. Yeah.
2 years old's a pretty good age to have your first musical story, so I'm not sure many people could rival that. So you talked about how music was always sort of where you wanted to end up. So was it clear that you always wanted music to be your career?
Yes, absolutely. When I was about 14, I was desperate to be a radio announcer on the concert program. And my speech and drama teacher said to me, "Don't be a radio announcer. You're a people person. You should be a teacher." And that was when I first changed my mind and decided that I would be a music teacher. And I guess education was always the first priority, and I'd never really thought about doing anything out in the professional world of musicians because I'd seen so many of my colleagues at university struggle to make ends meet, whereas teaching is quite, if you give teaching your all, it is quite a solid profession. And so now I'm sort of a bit freelance, so I'm still doing some teaching, but also doing a bit of professional work as well. So it's a nice balance.
Wonderful. And in your bio, I read out at the start, I mentioned you conduct now a handful of choirs, some high school choirs and also some youth choirs. So perhaps what was the first choir you really got up in front of the chance to wave your arms, and what was the first choir that you effectively were the music director of?
My first conducting opportunity was probably with my school orchestra. I wrote a piece when I was in year 12, so about age 16, for my school orchestra, and my music teacher said, "Why don't you conduct it?" So I did. And then I wrote another piece a sort of like a graduation march for our school prize giving when I was leaving high school, and I conducted that as well. And it was in that year that I first started singing in the New Zealand Youth Choir. So back then, the NZYC was ages 16 to 24, and I got in as a 16-year-old and was in the second bass section with some very proficient singers. It was a baptism by fire. And at the end of that very first course, Professor Peter Godfrey, who was the conductor, offered a conducting workshop day. And anybody from the choir who wanted to stay and have a go at conducting could do so. And so I decided to do it. And I was the youngest one there, and it was terrifying. But that, I guess, was the first sort of taste of choral conducting that I had. And it was just a lot of fun. I really loved it.
And now, however many years on, you're the first former singer of the New Zealand Youth Choir to be the director, and that's probably the role you're known most for internationally. So, could you tell us a little bit about, first of all, maybe what the New Zealand Youth Choir is, and now that you've been conducting that group for more than a decade now, almost 15 years, maybe give us some career highlights.
Sure. So the NZYC is currently ages 18 to 25, and we have 50 singers from all around the country. They're auditioned every 3 years. So most of the singers are in the choir for a 3-year cycle. And during that cycle, we would meet around 3 to 4 times per annum for up to about a week each time. So they need to be very proficient readers and very capable singers and musicians in order to be able to sing in the choir, because there's months when we don't see each other. And that can be a little bit terrifying as the MD, because you never quite know. The night before a youth choir course, my wife would tell you that my stomach's always in knots because I never quite know which version of the instrument is going to turn up. And I'm normally pleasantly surprised. But it is a wonderful, amazing choir. It has a fabulous reputation. They won the Choir of the World at Llangollen in Wales in 1999. They've won the Let the People Sing competition. They've won several other competitions around the world, and they perform a range of music from Western European music, various music of various cultures and ethnicities, and it's a really wonderful group. I think my only real sadness is that we can't get together more often because funding just won't allow that. So that's the NZYC. The my highlights. We've had some pretty phenomenal tours, but I think probably my highlights are occasional moments where the magic really comes together in performance, and it's that cumulative effect of a lot of very intricate rehearsal preparation, and very importantly, the building of relationships, relationships with the singers to one another, with them to me and the other staff, and relationships between the music and the singers, so that they understand a bit about what the composer might have meant, and they're able to find the different levels of artistry within pieces of music. And there have been some really spectacular moments that will certainly live in my heart. Often they're on tour, but sometimes they're in little locations in New Zealand where the magic's just come into the room and you can't quite explain why. But yeah, lots of wonderful moments.
That's great. Thank you. You talked about how that choir has singers coming from different parts of the country, many of which are seeking to make music a career in one way or another. As the director of a group like that, what do you see your role in helping musicians who are aspiring for careers in the arts to help them in their development?
I think what you're trying to, if they are about to study, or if they are studying voice, for example, we have quite a few singers who do classical voice at university, so they're doing tertiary degrees. And some of them want to go on to become opera singers or chorists around the world, and many do. And I think the things that I'm wanting them to get an experience of in the New Zealand Youth Choir is firstly a breadth of music making, a real understanding of different styles, different genres, different languages, harmony, intonation, all those things that really develop the musician's ear. And just as importantly, I think that giving them a concept of what it means to be a professional. Now, that's a tricky thing to say for a youth choir because they're not professional, they're not paid. In fact, they pay. So, but it is a training ground for how to work in the professional world. And I want them to leave having had amazing musical skills, built strong friendships, and to understand what it means to honor your commitments, to um, to give of your best to a task, to get on board with someone else's vision and help to bring it to life. I think those are all really, really important qualities that I would seek to pass on to singers.
One of the things you've drawn on in a couple of your answers is the fact that both of us being from a small country in the bottom of the Pacific, there are some constraints on what a choir can do. But equally, you've talked about how some of your biggest highlights with the group have been touring. So, coming from a country like New Zealand, why is touring so important? What do you see the value in taking choirs overseas?
Touring is obviously it's expensive, especially coming from New Zealand. I mean, it takes a good 24 plus hours to get to Europe from here. But I think that the first thing that it gives you is a little bit of a perspective on what it is that you're doing and why you're doing it. When a choir, say for example, when New Zealand Youth Choir went to Pardubice in the Czech Republic in 2016, the other choirs at that festival were from Poland, Russia, Germany, obviously the Czech Republic, Italy, and we were the only choir from the Southern Hemisphere. And it was so we were the exotic ones, and being the exotic ones is not something that Kiwis are used to. So going into an environment like that, and people being quite interested in the fact that we sang Mendelssohn, hopefully with very good German, but also we sang Maori waiata or Maori New Zealand cultural music um, with actions and hopefully with integrity. And there was a real interest in that. And I think it gives New Zealand choirs a bit of a perspective about who they are and why we do what we do. Um, the other thing I think it's quite good is to develop an ear for other aesthetics. So when you sing, um, for example, when you sing, I'll think of something, say, for example, Brahms. When you sing Brahms in St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, um, or in the Musikverein or one of those amazing venues, it suddenly makes sense acoustically and the aesthetic makes sense. And I remember on that same tour, we sang Vaughan Williams' three Shakespeare songs in Oxford. And there was an English conductor there who was talking to me afterwards, and she said it was just so interesting hearing a New Zealand choir singing Vaughan Williams because it sounded nothing like the way that the English sing it. The sound of a New Zealand choir is probably got a little bit more of a mix of European, even some American sound, like quite full and rich and a lot of fundamental and upper harmonics. So there's all sorts of different colors in the sound, which I think is a synthesis of what we call Pakeha or European New Zealander, Maori, Pacifica, Polynesian, Asian. All of the different influences in New Zealand are found in the sound. And the really fascinating thing is it's still developing. It's still changing. The New Zealand Youth Choir in 2024 does not sound like the New Zealand Youth Choir in 2004. It's quite a different sound. And that's a really interesting thing.
That's really interesting, and that leads it well into my next question. One of the things we're asking all of our guests from the different corners of the world is what makes choral music unique in your neck of the woods? What are the unique choral traditions from New Zealand? And I guess what do you see your role in developing those traditions?
Well, New Zealand is an incredibly young country. We've really only had a choral tradition since the very early 19th century. And I remember the first time I went to the UK, and I went into a pub, and the sign on the door said, "This pub is 400 years old." And I said to the person, the publican, "I can't believe your pub is 400 years old." And he said, "Oh, yeah, it's not that old." And I went, "This is older than any building that currently exists in New Zealand." And so we have a very young country, and the whole culture is still developing. And it's because it's happened in such a rapid amount of time. I think we're still finding out what it is that we really value and what it is that is our sound. Um, if you look at choral music from New Zealand 70 years ago, it leant very heavily on the English cathedral tradition, because that was what choral music meant. Church music in Anglican churches and cathedrals. And it has developed quite substantially since then. I think New Zealanders have always been very outward looking. We're not terribly insular. We look outward a lot, and like to see what other people are doing and judge ourselves against it, and find our own path. So the former director of New Zealand Youth Choir before me, Karen Grills, who was one of my conducting teachers, she brought a lot more Scandinavian, Baltic country influence to the sound of the choir, and a lot more of that repertoire made its way into the programming for the choir. And then also under her tenure, there was a lot more interest in linking up with Maori performing arts groups, or what we call kapahaka in New Zealand. And there were strong relationships that were developed with some of the leading kapahaka practitioners in New Zealand. And the choir was gifted pieces of music to sing, which is incredibly great honor. And those waiata, or songs, are what Maori call taonga, or treasures. So they're not given away freely, and they're not given away easily. You have to earn the respect to be able to perform them. And some of our favorite pieces in the New Zealand Youth Choir repertoire are those waiata. Now, even the way that those waiata are performed has changed in the 25 to 30 years that the choir has been performing, because our concept of what the language sounds like, our understanding of the nuance in the kupu, or the lyrics, is changing. And we're getting a bit smarter, and a bit more curious, and a bit more sensitive to what the Maori worldview, te ao Maori, what it is that underpins the waiata, and why we sing it the way we do. And I think that interest has lent itself to all sorts of different concepts of the way that we might approach any piece of music. We're always looking, for example, singing a spiritual. There's so many parallels between African American spirituals and Maori waiata, oppressed people, colonized people, and how those songs have quite significant underpinning thematic material that is sacred to the people who created it. And I think there's a strong understanding of that in New Zealand. And so we don't take that for granted. We treasure it, and we try to treat it with the utmost care and respect.
Enjoying the podcast? Why not check out what else IFCM is up to? Follow IFCM on Instagram or Facebook, or visit ifcm.net to hear about upcoming events and projects and to find a vast array of choral music resources. Thank you, David. The last question I want to ask in this section of the podcast is about young people. Looking at your CV, you've done a lot with your career, but young people seems to be the thing that is always there in the projects you've taken on. So, what is it about youth or young people that attracts you in your career to work with people of that age group?
I think partly my interest in working with young people is simply because when I decided to be a teacher, there was no question that it was going to be anything but secondary school. I could not teach primary school. Um, and I love teenagers and I love young people in the way that they bring a passion and a curiosity to what it is that they're doing. They want to be led, but they also want to be empowered, and they want to be given opportunities to perform really amazing music, to be shown new concepts and ideas about aesthetics and artistry, and to find that ability to do things that perhaps they didn't think they could do. And that is really interesting to me. I find that really empowering and heartening to see that happen with young people. Um, and and it's just where my passion is. I really love working with young people. I do work with some adults as well, but and I love that too. But that's more on an ad hoc basis in workshops and things like that. Yeah, certainly working with young people is where I see my passion.
Thanks, David. And that leads well into our next section of the podcast. As this podcast is geared towards young choral musicians and people who are looking at ways they can engage with choral music as they develop their careers and move forward into the later parts of their life, we're really interested to hear about any advice you might have for young musicians. So I guess as a starting point, what's the best thing someone can do who's maybe in their teens, early 20s, singing in a choir and has an interest in getting into conducting or a leadership role with a choir? What's the best thing they can do to start?
One of the first things that I would suggest is listen to a lot of music and watch people creating it, because you will, when you see rehearsals in progress, if you're allowed to go and be an observer in rehearsals, you will see a lot of different things, and you will see rehearsals moving at different paces. You will see conductors focusing on certain things. You'll start to build up your toolbox of things that work and things that don't necessarily work, things that you should replicate or things you should avoid doing. And also the things that suit your personal style, which of course will change. So that'd be the first thing. Develop musicianship as much as possible. Really get to grips with sight singing, with oral training, with understanding the historical context of music, repertoire development. Uh, and then I've got a few other things that I would definitely recommend to young people wanting to get into it if they wanted to be professional musicians. First one is to be vulnerable. Growth comes from being vulnerable. So you need to be prepared to let people who have been doing it longer than you work with you and guide you, not necessarily to say this gestural pattern is gospel and you must do it this way, because Bach didn't, obey all of the rules of harmony, but he knew what they were and how to break them. So it really is a case of finding what it is that is your personal style and your personal aesthetic, and be prepared to be flexible and adaptable about that. Don't get in your fixed idea about what a piece is like or something like that. I look back at the way that I thought about certain pieces of music in my early 20s, and I cringe now because they weren't at all what I thought they were. Be prepared to change your perspective, and leave a little bit of openness there for that to happen. Be a lifelong learner. that's a really, really important mantra of mine. Don't ever be afraid to learn from someone else about things that you don't necessarily know. Don't be afraid to call on experts. If someone knows languages better than you do, or if they're a better pianist than you, or if they understand gesture better than you do, then soak up that knowledge. The Māori have this wonderful term called ako, and ako means essentially both teaching and learning, because teachers learn from their students and learners sometimes teach their teachers. So I love that whole idea of everybody bringing their ideas. You share your knowledge with me, I'll share mine with you, and together we will be stronger. And that involves that concept of both vulnerability and being a lifelong learner. And another one, especially for conductors, value your team. Make sure that you honor them for their service, that you check in with them, build relationships with them, don't be superficial with them, nurture and empower them, and weed out any problems as soon as you're able to do so. I say this, but I know that I don't always get this right, but it's certainly my aim to do that. And then the last one, a little bit of an odd one, I guess. Be reliable. Answer emails. If people email you and they are asking something, answer emails, honor your commitments, and give of your best to the task that you sign up to. If you can't do something, say that you can't do something. If you want help, say that you want help. Just keep communicating. The people who shut themselves off or become unreliable, certainly a country as small as New Zealand, get a reputation for that, and then people stop using them or don't want to work with them. So make sure that if you're going into a professional world, that you learn very quickly what it means to honor your commitments.
That's a really useful list of tips. Ultimately, I suppose the best experience a conductor can get in the early stages of their career is getting up in front of a choir and having a chance to wave their arms. What sort of opportunities are there in our part of the world, in Australia and New Zealand, for young conductors? And do you think choral organisations and choirs are doing enough to support the next generation of choral talent?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've done a little bit of work in Australia, and they because they have states and New Zealand doesn't have this. There tends to be like pockets of activity going on that isn't particularly related to other parts of the country. Whereas I think in New Zealand, because it's one country, it's quite small. Most people know each other. There's a little bit more homogeneous sharing of ideas and that sort of thing. But there are certainly really good training opportunities. In New Zealand, the Choral Federation runs or manages, oversees the Association of Choral Directors, New Zealand Association of Choral Directors. And there is a convention that is run every 2 years called Choral Connect, which is for choral leaders. And we say that now because they're not all conductors as such. Some of them don't want to be known as conductors. A lot of primary school choir leaders would consider themselves to be choir leaders or choir teachers rather than conductors, because they don't do a lot of conducting gesture as such. So we're basically, and also that can be administrators, it can be deputy conductors, rehearsal pianists, repetiteurs, could be almost anyone who's involved in working with choirs. So that's a really good system. There's a group in Australia called ASSET, Australian Choral Conducting Education and Training, that's run by Faye Dumont out of Melbourne, and I know that Gondwana in Sydney has a fabulous choral conductor training program, and so does Burley in Brisbane. So there are pockets like all over the place of things happening. I think in Auckland Youth Choir we have an emerging conductor emerging collaborative pianist and emerging composer every year. And although we are, because we have to match it up with the short amount of time that we have to prepare repertoire for upcoming concerts, I'd love to be able to offer conductors more time on the podium. But we're doing a little bit of work, like the conductor that we had this year. She probably had 8 or 9 opportunities to get up and conduct across the year, and then also conducted pieces in at least two concerts. And I also met with her, and we looked at gesture. We went through score preparation. We talked about rehearsal technique. More choirs could be doing that. More community choirs could be doing that in New Zealand. And I think that it would be very valuable for young people to have that opportunity to have a little bit of fostered training, rather than just being thrown in the deep end.
Yeah, it's great to hear that there's more and more opportunities in our part of the world that are coming up. And I suppose the gold standard for development as a choral leader would be to get along to one of the IFCM choral symposia. Have you ever been to a IFCM symposium?
I have. I went to Barcelona in 2017 and absolutely loved it. I remember watching, I think it was Helmut Ridding working with developing conductors, including a friend of mine who's a conductor here in Auckland, and and just going in and watching conductors work with experts in masterclass scenarios. And it is amazing. The symposium is phenomenal. Of course, I was really looking forward to the one in Auckland in 2020, which sadly got cancelled because of a pandemic. But hopefully it will come back down again this way at some point.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Um, as someone who's really the first generation that has come fully through the New Zealand choral establishment, I suppose, coming through the New Zealand Youth Choir and now moving to direct that choir, you're well placed to talk about developing as a choral musician, as a conductor. So I suppose a question I would have for you is: have you had any mentors? Do you still have any mentors that you still speak to or look up to develop to develop as a conductor yourself?
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Karen Grills, who was my conducting teacher at university, both undergraduate and postgraduate, um, is a mentor who I've worked with very closely for many years. She's known me since I was 17, so most of my life, and she is just amazing ears. She has phenomenal ears, and she's really phenomenal with gesture. So that's been really useful to be able to talk to her. I've also had the opportunity to talk to quite a few people around the world who I respect and have looked up to for many years. For example, I did some work with Rodney Eichenberger when he's been out to New Zealand a couple of times, and also Andre Thomas. And I remember when I was an undergraduate, I think it might have been my first year of university, and Eric Eriksson brought his choir out from Stockholm. And I was just completely blown away watching him work. He's someone I would have loved to have just gone to Sweden and watched him rehearse, because his gestures were so almost the opposite of what people said you should do. But he got the most amazing sound out of his choir. And I realized that a lot of that must have developed in rehearsal. So he must have a really good way of working in rehearsal to enable the singers feel the freedom to be able to do what he wanted them to do, despite his gesture not always being standard, I suppose you'd say. And then we're lucky we live in the internet age. It's not that hard to find some fantastic training online, to reach out to people around the world and ask for their opinions. Of course, there's fabulous training that goes on, particularly in the USA and parts of Europe in choral conducting. And I did my conductor training here at the University of Auckland, and loved that. It was great. Yeah. So lots of people, lots of people.
One of your pieces of advice earlier on was to remain a lifelong learner. So are you, as well as helping train the next generation of choral musicians, still seeking out development opportunities yourself? What sort of things are you doing these days to continue to push yourself?
Yeah, I am, of course, going along to the Choral Connect sessions to observe and learn from experts who we get to those, and every so often international sessions with people when I get that opportunity. Most of my time, I think, is reaching out to other people who are in a similar position to me and asking them, working with young people primarily, and discussing repertoire approaches to certain musical issues that we might come up with. Yeah, it's really broadening the repertoire, I think. That's a big one, is getting a better idea about what repertoire works, what repertoire doesn't, um, and anything that can be done to enhance the artistry of the repertoire that you are doing with the group that you've got in front of you, which in my case is never professional groups. It's and it's not always at the very, very highest level that you can get. So you've got to be able to make the music with the instrument that you have. So how do you get it to the highest possible standard? I'm interested in that.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, you've had a pretty impressive career, but what's still on the bucket list? What would you still like to do um in the choral music world?
I'd love to go and spend a little bit more time overseas. Just not necessarily living overseas, but traveling and working overseas. I've started to be asked to serve on a few more choral juries, which is always interesting because you get to interact with other choral professionals and share ideas and build relationships with them. Um, so I'd love to go and do a little bit more work overseas and potentially just build. Look, I'm not sure what the next thing is going to be in New Zealand for me. I'm very open to opportunity. So um, I love what I do. I feel like I'm in a really good place at the moment, and I wouldn't change anything about what I'm doing right now. So I'm probably more living in the moment musically rather than actively seeking new things to do. I mean, I would love to be able to take some New Zealand music, a bit more New Zealand music overseas, and commission more pieces. That's financially, I'd love for the New Zealand Youth Choir, for example, to be able to have enough funding to commission 2 or 3 pieces per annum, and premiere those works, work with the composers when they're creating them, and then bring those to life for audiences. Yeah, those are the things that bring joy. So, uh, I guess, yeah, open to opportunities at the moment.
And there's an exciting tour planned for next year with the New Zealand Youth Choir. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going to be happening next year?
Yeah, so the whole thing about building relationships is going to be borne out by this tour because during COVID I met Darius Lim online in Singapore, and finally got to meet him in New Zealand in person, and then during the World Choir Games this year, and then a month or so later, I was in Singapore on the jury for the Singapore International Choral Festival, and I got to go and see Darius's workplace and look at how the New Zealand Youth Choir might perform there next year. So we've got an exchange concert happening in Singapore on our way to Europe, and then we go to Denmark to the European Choir Games. We will be competing there, and in 2 categories, and then we head over to the UK, and we're going back to the Eisteddfod in Llangollen in North Wales, and I think probably finishing with a concert in London. So there's definitely a concert in Oxford, and so that's a very exciting trip.
It certainly is, and I'm looking forward to joining you in the New Zealand Youth Choir on that trip. To support the work of IFCM, consider becoming a member or making a donation. Visit ifcm.net. Any support helps IFCM's volunteers connect the choral world. So, if we move through to the final section of this podcast, we have a short list of quick fire questions we're asking all of our guests just to get some of their favourites and some of their hot takes. So, first answer that comes to your head, put it out. So, who's your
Okay.
favorite choral composer?
Johann Sebastian Bach, easy. The
Very,
motets and the passions are unparalleled.
very good. And what about your favorite choral conductor, dead or alive?
Um, Eric Erickson, it might have just been that I was about 18 when I saw him conduct, that he had a profound impact on me. And I've watched a lot of his stuff online and listened to a lot of his music. Um, I think Eric Erickson probably would be up there for me.
And a favorite piece of music?
Again, about the same age. I bought my first compact disc player, and the third compact disc that I bought was a an album by the Cambridge Singers of English choral music. And I came across a piece by Edward Elgar called There Is Sweet Music. And I was reading the liner notes of the CD back when you could do such a thing. And it was talking about the fact that Elgar wrote this piece in two keys. So the tenors and basses are in G major, and the sopranos and altos are in A flat major, and they're literally written a semitone apart. And it is the most spectacularly beautiful piece of music with a poem by Tennyson. And I had always loved that piece. And then in the last cycle of the New Zealand Youth Choir, we finally got to perform it. And I ended up conducting it in the Sydney Opera House with NZYC, which was a real treat. So that's one of my all-time favorites.
And it was certainly a highlight for me sitting in the audience at one of your New Zealand Youth Choir concerts. So a good pick. What would you be your favorite language to sing in?
Um, I always say English is an annoying language. The poetry is really amazing. So if a choir can sing really well in English, it's a wonderful language to sing in. Personally, I think probably because my two favorite choral composers are Bach and Brahms, um, with Mendelssohn not too far behind. I think probably German would be my favorite because the language is so evocative, and when it's sung really well, it's incredibly expressive, and it's a wonderful language to sing in.
Very good. And what is the best acoustic in the world? And have you had the chance to sing or conduct there?
Ooh, okay. Difficult to say what would be the best in the world. The best acoustic in New Zealand used to be the Catholic Basilica in Christchurch, which unfortunately was destroyed in the earthquake in 2011, and I think is now completely torn down. Um, the best acoustic one of the most impressive acoustics that I've conducted a choir in was St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and that was the scale of the building was unbelievable. I just couldn't believe it. And then probably another really amazing place was Ely Cathedral. I had a New Zealand Youth Choir concert in Ely Cathedral in 2016, and that was a beautiful acoustic, really lovely. Um, yeah, those would probably be my two favorites, I think.
No, it's a good list. Final question would be if you could have dinner with any musician, choral or otherwise, dead or alive, who would it be?
I think probably Ella Fitzgerald. I'm a big fan of Ella. Her singing, she came from such a difficult background and started out as a dancer and then moved in singing with Chick Webb's band and moving into singing. And I just love her storytelling and song. And I'd also love to ask her the secret of how she never ever sang a note out of tune. Well, I've yet to hear one.
Well, David, thank you very, very much for joining us on Unison, this IFCM podcast. We envisage our audience will largely be young people. So, do you have any final words you might want to share with aspiring choral musicians, singers, conductors out there?
I think the thing I would say is just keep listening, keep learning. and keep that love going for the artistry of what it is that you do. Don't be despondent if things don't always go your way. Forge your own path and make sure that you're still enjoying it.
David Squire, thank you very much. All the best.
Thank you.
That was Unison, brought to you by the Young Committee of the International Federation for Choral Music. If you have any feedback or ideas for the podcast, you can email us at young@ifcm.net. Thank you to our guest for their time, and thank you to you for listening.